5-year-old Ruby suddenly stood up in the middle of the concert and started screaming with all her might, "Mommy! Mommy! Where are you? Where is my mommy?" The hall filled with thousands of people fell silent in an instant, everyone watching in shock at this little girl's desperation. Her voice echoed through the massive auditorium like a wounded bird's cry, cutting through the music and reaching into the hearts of every person present. Ruby's small body shook with the force of her screams, her face red and streaked with tears as she frantically looked around the crowd, as if expecting her mother to materialize from thin air. The people around her froze, unsure how to respond to such raw, unbridled grief coming from someone so young. Some reached out tentatively, wanting to comfort her, but not knowing if they should touch a child so clearly in distress. The music stopped abruptly as even the band members turned to see what was happening. The silence that followed was deafening. 30,000 people holding their collective breath as they witnessed a child's heart breaking in real time. Ruby's screams grew more desperate, more piercing, as if she believed that if she called loud enough, her mother would somehow hear her and come back. Her father, Thomas, sat frozen beside her, his own heart shattering as he watched his daughter's pain spill out in front of all these strangers. He had brought her to the concert hoping that music might distract her from her grief, but instead, being surrounded by so many happy families had only made her absence more acute, more unbearable. But what Ruby didn't know was that Elvis's response to her desperate cries would stop her screaming, move 30,000 people to tears, and remind her that her mother had never really left her at all. 6 months earlier, Ruby's world had collapsed when her mother, Sarah, died suddenly in a car accident on a rainy Thursday evening. Sarah had been driving home from her job at the local library when a drunk driver ran a red light and crashed into her car. She was killed instantly, leaving behind a devastated husband and a 5-year-old daughter who couldn't understand why mommy wasn't coming home anymore. Ruby and Sarah had shared an extraordinarily close bond. Sarah was not just Ruby's mother but her best friend, playmate, and constant companion. They did everything together, baking cookies on Sunday afternoons, reading stories before bed, dancing around the living room to music on the radio, and having tea parties with Ruby's stuffed animals. Sarah had a gift for making even the most ordinary moments feel magical, turning grocery shopping into treasure hunts and bedtime into adventures to far-off lands. In the months following Sarah's death, Ruby had struggled to understand the concept of forever. She would ask her father when mommy was coming home, when they could call her on the phone, why she wasn't at the dinner table anymore. Thomas tried his best to explain death in terms a 5-year-old could grasp, but how do you tell a child that the person who tucked her in every night, who knew exactly how to braid her hair and which songs to sing when she was scared, would never come back? Ruby had developed what the grief counselor called searching behaviors. She would look for her mother in crowds, call out to women who resembled her from behind, and sometimes wake up in the middle of the night crying for mommy to come and chase away the monsters. The counselor assured Thomas that this was normal, part of the grieving process, but watching his daughter's confusion and pain was almost more than he could bear. Thomas himself was drowning in his own grief while trying to be strong for Ruby. He had lost not only his wife but his parenting partner, the person who knew exactly what to do when Ruby had nightmares or refused to eat her vegetables. Now he was fumbling through single parenthood while dealing with his own overwhelming sense of loss and loneliness. The decision to attend the Elvis concert had been born of desperation. Thomas remembered how Sarah used to sing Elvis songs while doing housework, how she would grab Ruby and dance with her whenever "Can't Help Falling in Love" came on the radio. He hoped that maybe, somehow, the music that had once brought his family so much joy might help Ruby feel closer to her mother's memory. The Las Vegas International hotel was buzzing with excitement as thousands of Elvis fans gathered for what was being billed as one of the King's most spectacular performances. The venue was enormous, with a capacity of 30,000 people, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and overwhelming. Families, couples, and groups of friends filled every seat, all united by their love for Elvis and their anticipation of an unforgettable evening. Thomas and Ruby had seats in the middle section, close enough to see the stage clearly, but far enough back to feel part of the larger crowd experience. Thomas had chosen their location carefully, wanting Ruby to feel the energy of the audience while not being overwhelmed by being too close to the front. He hoped that being surrounded by so many happy, excited people might lift Ruby's spirits and remind her that joy was still possible in the world. As they found their seats, Ruby looked around with wide eyes at the massive crowd. She had never been in such a large group of people before, and the sheer scale of the venue was both exciting and intimidating. Thomas pointed out interesting things to her: the elaborate stage setup, the musicians tuning their instruments, the people in costumes and elaborate outfits who had dressed up for the occasion. "Look, sweetheart," Thomas said gently, "all these people came here to have fun and listen to music. Remember how Mommy used to love Elvis songs?" Ruby nodded solemnly, but her eyes were already scanning the crowd with that searching expression Thomas had come to recognize. She was looking for her mother among the thousands of faces, hoping against hope that maybe this would be the place where she would finally find her again. The people around them were a diverse group: elderly couples who had been Elvis fans since the 1950s, middle-aged parents introducing their children to the King's music, young adults discovering his songs for the first time, and tourists who had come to Las Vegas specifically for this show. The atmosphere was festive and warm, with strangers striking up conversations about their favorite Elvis songs and sharing stories of previous concerts. Ruby listened to these conversations with interest, but Thomas could see that hearing people talk about memories and experiences was making her think about all the memories she would never be able to make with her mother. Her small face began to cloud over, and she started fidgeting in her seat, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the minutes passed. When the lights dimmed and Elvis made his entrance, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 30,000 people rose to their feet in unison, screaming, applauding, and reaching toward the stage as if they could somehow touch their idol. Elvis wore his iconic white jumpsuit with elaborate crystal and gold beading that caught the stage lights like captured fire. His presence was magnetic, commanding every eye in the venue and somehow making each person feel like he was performing exclusively for them. "Good evening, Las Vegas," Elvis called out, his voice carrying easily through the sophisticated sound system and reaching every corner of the massive venue. The crowd roared back their greeting, a wall of sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into everyone's bones. Thomas watched Ruby's reaction carefully, hoping to see some spark of interest or excitement. For a moment, she seemed captivated by the spectacle, the lights, the music, the sheer energy of the crowd around her. But as Elvis launched into his opening number and the people around them began dancing and singing along, Thomas could see Ruby's expression changing. Instead of being caught up in the joy around her, Ruby began to withdraw into herself. The sight of so many people having fun with their families and friends only highlighted what she was missing. She watched couples dancing together, parents singing along with their children, grandparents sharing smiles with their grandchildren, and with each happy family she observed, her own loss became more acute. Elvis commanded the stage with movements that seemed both rehearsed and spontaneous, his voice soaring through classics like Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel. The band behind him was tight and professional. The backup singers provided perfect harmonies, and the lighting design created an almost cinematic experience that had the audience completely mesmerized. But Ruby was becoming increasingly agitated. She started shifting in her seat, her breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. Thomas could see that she was struggling with something, but before he could ask what was wrong, Ruby began looking around the crowd more frantically, her searching behavior becoming more pronounced and desperate. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "where is Mommy?" Mommy, she should be here. She loved Elvis songs. Thomas's heart clenched as he tried to think of how to respond. How could he explain once again that Mommy wasn't coming, that she would never be at another concert or family outing or ordinary Tuesday dinner? Before he could formulate an answer, Ruby's agitation reached a breaking point. It happened during a quiet moment between songs, when Elvis was talking to the audience about the power of music to bring people together. Ruby had been growing more and more distressed, her 5-year-old mind unable to process why everyone around her was happy when the most important person in her world was missing. Suddenly, without warning, Ruby stood up on her chair and began screaming at the top of her lungs, "Mommy! Mommy! Where are you? Where is my mommy?" Her voice cut through the silence like a knife, so loud and desperate that it seemed to reach every corner of the massive venue. The raw pain in her cry was unmistakable. This wasn't a tantrum or a moment of childish petulance, but the anguished wail of a heart that had been broken beyond repair. The effect on the audience was immediate and profound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned in their seats to locate the source of the crying. Parents instinctively held their own children closer. The musicians on stage paused, their instruments falling silent as they tried to understand what was happening. Ruby continued screaming, her small body shaking with the force of her emotions. "I want my mommy! She's supposed to be here. Mommy, please come back." Thomas reached for his daughter, trying to comfort her, but Ruby was beyond consolation. 6 months of suppressed grief and confusion were pouring out of her in one devastating moment. She had reached her breaking point, and nothing could hold back the flood of pain that had been building inside her. The silence in the auditorium was deafening, except for Ruby's heartbroken screams. 30,000 people sat frozen, witnessing a child's most vulnerable moment. Many began to tear up themselves, recognizing the universal pain of loss and the particular cruelty of a child having to experience such devastating grief. Some audience members started to whisper among themselves, wondering what should be done, whether someone should help, whether this was something they should be witnessing. But most simply sat in stunned silence, their hearts breaking for this little girl whose pain was so raw and immediate that it seemed to fill the entire venue. On stage, Elvis had stopped mid-sentence when Ruby's screams first pierced the air. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his experienced performer's instincts telling him that something significant was happening that demanded his attention. As Ruby's cries continued, Elvis's expression shifted from confusion to deep concern. Elvis had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to read his audiences, to sense when someone in the crowd needed something more than entertainment. But Ruby's screams were impossible to ignore or misinterpret. This was a child in profound distress, and every parental instinct Elvis possessed was immediately activated. He walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes scanning the audience to locate the source of the crying. When he spotted Ruby, a tiny figure standing on her chair, her face red and streaked with tears, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs, his heart immediately went out to her. Elvis could see Thomas trying desperately to comfort his daughter, could see the exhaustion and grief in the man's face that spoke of months of dealing with this kind of pain. He could see how other audience members were responding, some with compassion, others with discomfort, all of them uncertain about what to do in the face of such raw emotion. But most importantly, Elvis could hear in Ruby's cries the specific kind of grief that comes from losing a parent. He had experienced loss himself, had seen enough pain in his years of performing to recognize when someone was calling out from the deepest place of hurt. This wasn't a child having a bad day. This was a child whose world had been shattered. Without hesitation, Elvis made a decision that would change not only Ruby's life, but the lives of everyone in that auditorium. He set down his microphone, signaled to his band to stop playing completely, and began walking toward the steps that led down into the audience. What happened next was something that had never occurred in Elvis's career and would never happen again. He left the stage entirely, walking down into the audience while Ruby's screams continued to echo through the venue. Security personnel started to move, unsure of protocol for this situation, but Elvis waved them back, indicating that he knew what he was doing. The audience watched in amazement as their idol, still wearing his elaborate jumpsuit and stage makeup, made his way through the crowd toward the distressed child. People automatically cleared a path for him, their faces showing a mixture of surprise, admiration, and emotional investment in what was unfolding. Elvis moved with purpose, but not haste, understanding that approaching a traumatized child required careful, deliberate action. As he got closer to Ruby, he could hear her words more clearly. "I want my mommy. She's supposed to be here. Mommy loved Elvis. Where is she, Daddy? Where is she?" The words hit Elvis like a physical blow. This child wasn't just upset about being at a concert. She was grieving the loss of her mother, and something about being in this happy, family-filled environment had triggered her pain in a way that couldn't be contained. When Elvis reached Ruby's row, the people around her looked up at him with expressions of awe and gratitude. Here was their idol, the person they had paid to see perform on a distant stage, approaching their section to help a child in distress. Thomas looked up at Elvis with tears in his eyes, clearly overwhelmed by both his daughter's pain and this unexpected kindness from a stranger. "Is it okay if I try to help?" Elvis asked Thomas quietly, his voice gentle and respectful of the father's authority even in this moment of crisis. Thomas nodded, unable to speak through his own tears. Ruby was still crying, though her screams had diminished somewhat now that she sensed something significant was happening around her. Elvis knelt down in the aisle next to Ruby's seat, bringing himself to her eye level. His movements were slow and careful, understanding that a grieving child might be startled by sudden gestures or unfamiliar voices. Ruby continued to sob, but she was looking at him now, her tear-filled eyes trying to process who this kind stranger was and why he was paying attention to her. "Hi there, sweetheart," Elvis said softly, his voice taking on the gentle tone he might use with his own family. "I heard you calling for your mommy. That must mean you love her very much." Ruby's crying slowed as she focused on this new person who was speaking directly to her, who wasn't trying to shush her or tell her to stop crying, but was instead acknowledging what she had been screaming about. She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "My mommy's gone," Ruby whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "She went away and she's not coming back, and I don't know where she is." Elvis felt his heart break at the simple, devastating honesty of her words. Around them, the audience was completely silent, straining to hear this conversation between the king of rock and roll and a grieving 5-year-old child. "That sounds very scary and very sad," Elvis replied, his voice carrying clearly through the venue's sound system without him even trying. "It must be really hard not to have your mommy here with you, especially when there are so many families around having fun together." Ruby nodded vigorously, finally feeling like someone understood exactly what was wrong. "I see all the other mommies and daddies, and I want my mommy too. She loved Elvis songs, and she would have loved this, and she should be here." The audience members who could hear Ruby's words felt their own tears starting to flow. Here was a child articulating grief with a clarity that many adults couldn't achieve, expressing the fundamental unfairness of loss in terms that everyone could understand. "You know what?" Elvis said, settling more comfortably in the aisle as if he had all the time in the world for this conversation. "I think your mommy is here with you tonight." Ruby looked confused, glancing around as if expecting to see her mother materialize. "No, she's not. I looked everywhere. She's gone." "Well," Elvis continued gently, "let me ask you something. When you were missing your mommy just now, what made you think about her?" Ruby considered the question seriously. "The music. She used to sing Elvis songs when she was cooking and cleaning, and she would dance with me. So the music made you remember your mommy?" "Yes," Ruby said, her crying settling into quiet sniffles. "And when you remember your mommy, how does that feel in your heart?" Ruby thought about this, placing her small hand over her chest. "It feels warm, but it hurts too." "That warm feeling," Elvis said softly, "that's your mommy's love. It's still right there in your heart, and nothing can ever take it away. When you hear music that reminds you of her, when you remember dancing with her, that's her being with you." The audience was completely captivated by this exchange, many of them crying openly as they watched Elvis help this child work through her grief with a wisdom and gentleness that transcended his his celebrity status. "But I can't see her," Ruby protested. "I can't hug her." "I know, sweetheart," Elvis replied. "And that's the hard part about missing someone we love. We can't see them with our eyes or hug them with our arms, but we can feel them in our hearts, and we can talk to them any time we want. Would you like to try something with me?" Elvis asked Ruby. "Would you like to sing one of the songs your mommy used to love, and maybe she'll be able to hear us?" Ruby looked uncertain. "Will she really hear us?" "I believe she will," Elvis said with complete sincerity. "And I think all these people here tonight would love to help us sing to your mommy." What was her favorite Elvis song?
"Love Me Tender," Ruby said immediately. "She sang it to me every night before bed." Elvis smiled, and for the first time since her breakdown began, Ruby managed a tiny smile in return. "That's one of my favorites too. Would you like to sing it with me right here, right now, so your mommy knows you're thinking about her?" Ruby nodded eagerly, and Elvis signaled to his band, who had been watching this entire exchange with tears in their eyes. The opening notes of "Love Me Tender" began to play, soft and gentle, creating a tender atmosphere that seemed to wrap around Ruby like a musical hug. Elvis began to sing, his voice taking on an even more tender quality than usual. He sang the first verse alone, giving Ruby time to find her courage and remember the words her mother had sung to her so many times. When the second verse began, Elvis looked at Ruby encouragingly. "Your turn, sweetheart. Sing to your mommy." Ruby's voice emerged softly at first, tentative and shaky, but as she continued, it grew stronger. She sang the words her mother had sung to her countless times, and as she did, something magical happened. Her tears stopped flowing, replaced by a sense of peace and connection that she hadn't felt since her mother's death. As Ruby's sweet, clear voice joined Elvis's powerful one, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the auditorium. People who had been watching this intimate moment in respectful silence began to sing along, their voices creating a harmony of support and love that filled the entire venue. It started with just a few voices in Ruby's immediate area, people who were close enough to see her face, to witness the transformation that was taking place as she sang. But as more people realized what was happening, the song spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Soon, all 30,000 people in the venue were singing "Love Me Tender" together, creating a moment of collective healing and shared humanity that none of them would ever forget. The sound was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced, not the wild, exciting energy of a typical Elvis concert, but something much deeper and more profound. Ruby looked around in wonder as she heard thousands of voices joining hers, all singing the song her mother had loved. For the first time since her breakdown, she smiled, not just a tiny, tentative smile, but a real, genuine expression of joy and wonder. "Do you hear that, Ruby?" Elvis asked softly as they sang. "All these people are singing with you, helping you tell your mommy how much you love her. Do you think she can hear us now?" Ruby nodded, her face glowing with a peace that had been absent for months. "I think she's listening," she whispered. "I think she's happy." As the song drew to a close, the entire auditorium fell into a reverent silence. Ruby was no longer crying, no longer desperate and frantic. Instead, she looked calm and centered, as if some fundamental piece of her world had been restored. Elvis remained kneeling next to Ruby for a few more moments, speaking to her in quiet tones that the audience couldn't hear. He was telling her that whenever she missed her mother, she could sing their song and remember how much she was loved. He reminded her that her mother would always be proud of her, especially for being brave enough to share her feelings even when they were scary and overwhelming. "Thank you," Ruby said to Elvis, her voice clear and strong. "I feel better now. I think Mommy heard us singing." "I know she did, sweetheart," Elvis replied. "And she wants you to be happy and to keep singing, because that's how you keep her love alive in the world." Elvis stood and addressed the audience, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ruby has just reminded us all that love never really dies, that music has the power to connect us with those we've lost, and that sometimes the most beautiful performances come from the heart rather than the stage." The audience erupted in the most heartfelt applause any of them had ever given, not just for Elvis, but for Ruby's courage and for the privilege of witnessing such a profound moment of healing. Elvis walked Ruby back to her father, who was crying tears of gratitude and amazement.
"Thank you," Thomas whispered to Elvis. "I've been trying to help her for months, and you gave her exactly what she needed." "She's a special little girl," Elvis replied, "and her mother raised her well. You can see the love in everything about her." As Elvis made his way back to the stage, Ruby settled into her father's arms, calm and peaceful for the first time in months. She watched the rest of the concert with genuine enjoyment, occasionally humming along to songs and pointing out moments she knew her mother would have loved. The story of Ruby's breakdown and Elvis's response spread far beyond that concert hall, becoming one of those rare moments that transcends entertainment and touches something fundamental about human nature and compassion. In the days that followed, newspapers across the country picked up the story, with headlines like "Elvis Stops Concert to Comfort Grieving Child," "The Night the King's Compassion Moved 30,000 to Tears," and "When Rock and Roll Became Healing Music." Television news programs featured interviews with audience members who described the evening as life-changing, transformative, and unlike anything they had ever witnessed. But more importantly than the media attention was Ruby's continued healing journey. The concert had given her something that months of grief counseling and well-meaning advice from family and friends had been unable to provide: a new way to understand her relationship with her mother that didn't require her to forget or move on, but rather to carry her mother's love forward in a different form. In the weeks following the concert, Ruby began talking about her mother more openly, sharing memories and expressing her feelings instead of bottling them up until they exploded in public places. She would tell Thomas about dreams she had where her mother came to visit, and instead of these dreams making her sadder, they seemed to bring her comfort. She began asking to listen to Elvis songs at home, and she would often sing "Love Me Tender" when she was missing her mother particularly strongly, just as Elvis had suggested. Thomas was amazed by the transformation in his daughter. The angry, desperate child who had been searching frantically for her mother in every crowd was gradually being replaced by someone who could acknowledge her loss while also celebrating the love that remained. Ruby still had difficult days. Grief doesn't disappear overnight, even after powerful healing moments, but she had tools now to cope with her emotions that she hadn't possessed before. The change was noticeable to everyone who knew Ruby. Her kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Peterson, commented on how much more engaged Ruby had become in class activities. Where once she had sat quietly at her desk, barely participating, she now raised her hand to answer questions and had even volunteered to sing a song during show and tell about her mother. The school counselor, who had been working with Ruby since the accident, was amazed by her progress and asked Thomas what had changed. Dr. Martinez, Ruby's grief counselor, was particularly interested in the concert experience and its therapeutic effects. She began incorporating music therapy into her sessions with other grieving children, finding that Ruby's story often helped families understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather finding new ways to maintain connection with lost loved ones. She would often tell parents about the night Elvis helped a little girl discover that love doesn't end with death, but transforms into something that can be carried forward through memory, music, and shared experience. Elvis himself was deeply moved by the experience and its aftermath. When reporters asked him about that night, he would often become emotional, explaining that Ruby had reminded him of the real purpose behind his music, not just to entertain, but to heal, to comfort, and to bring people together in their most vulnerable moments. "That little girl taught me more about the power of music in 5 minutes than I had learned in 20 years of performing," he said in one interview. "She showed me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just see someone's pain and respond to it with love." The experience influenced Elvis's approach to his remaining concerts as well. He became more attentive to his audiences, more willing to pause his performances when he sensed someone in the crowd was struggling, and more deliberate about using his platform to spread messages of healing and hope. Band members and venue staff noticed the change in him. He seemed more purposeful, more connected to the deeper meaning behind his performances. The 30,000 people who witnessed that evening carried the memory with them as a reminder of the power of compassion compassion, and the importance of responding to others' pain with kindness rather than discomfort. Many of them reported that Ruby's courage in expressing her grief had helped them process their own losses more openly. Support groups across the country began using the story as an example of how healing can happen in unexpected ways and places. One audience member, a nurse named Patricia who had been struggling with her own grief after losing her father, wrote a letter to the local newspaper describing how watching Ruby's breakthrough had inspired her to finally seek counseling for her own unresolved emotions. If a 5-year-old could be brave enough to let her pain show and accept help from a stranger, she wrote, then maybe I could be brave enough to get the help I needed too. A grandfather who had attended the concert with his family began volunteering at a local children's hospice, inspired by Elvis's example of how to respond to a child in crisis. A young couple who had been trying to shield their own daughter from news of her grandmother's terminal illness realized that honesty and openness might be more healing than protection, and they began having age-appropriate conversations about death and love that continued beyond death. For Ruby, the 5-year-old girl whose screams of anguish had once filled a concert hall, that night became a turning point in her understanding of love, loss, and the enduring power of music to heal even the deepest wounds. She learned that grief doesn't have to be carried alone, that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes the most unexpected people can appear at exactly the right moment to help us find our way back to hope. Years later, when Ruby was in high school and had developed into a confident young woman with a beautiful singing voice, she would often perform "Love Me Tender" at school concerts and talent shows. Each time she would dedicate the song to her mother and briefly tell the story of the night. Elvis helped her understand that love never really dies. Her performances were always deeply moving, infused with an understanding of loss and healing that most teenagers couldn't possibly possess. The purple dress she wore that night was carefully preserved in her closet, and sometimes, when she was preparing for important performances or facing difficult challenges, she would hold it and remember the feeling of being surrounded by 30,000 strangers who had chosen to respond to her pain with love rather than judgment. The connection between Ruby and Elvis also continued over the years. They exchanged Christmas cards and occasional letters, with Elvis always checking on her progress and encouraging her musical development. When Ruby graduated from high school as valedictorian, Elvis sent her a congratulatory telegram that she treasured. Their friendship, born in a moment of crisis and compassion, became a lasting reminder that human connections can transcend celebrity, age, and circumstance when they're built on genuine care and understanding. The concert that had begun with Ruby's desperate cries for her mother ended with her peaceful acceptance that her mother's love would always be with her, carried forward through music, memory, and the kindness of strangers who chose to respond to a child's pain with compassion rather than indifference. In the end, Elvis's response to Ruby's breakdown didn't just stop her screaming, it transformed her understanding of grief itself, showing her that love is stronger than loss, and that music really can work miracles when it comes from the heart.